What if a single letter, folded into a pocket at the Marne in 1914, held more historical truth than any official report? Today, you're about to hear a soldier's words as he wrote them. Line by line, his voice caught between hope and fear. He doesn't name the battle or the strategy. Instead, he whispers about a change, one that would alter not only his future, but the course of the war. We'll pause on those words, ask what he meant, and discover how an ordinary man captured history without ever intending to. Listen quietly as the paper breathes under the light, its creases carrying years of quiet survival. These words were set down in early September 1914, the day surrounding the first Battle of the Marne, when nothing yet seemed certain. Tonight, we open them again, not as strategy, but as testimony, a lantern in the margins of history. We'll let the soldier speak, then show you how his single phrase maps onto a moment that changed the war, and it all begins with the letter itself. Picture a folded sheet of paper carried against a soldier's chest, its creases worn from days of marching. When unfolded, the page reveals hurried lines of handwriting, some faint where the ink ran dry, others pressed deeper into the fibres of the paper. There is no official seal, no careful drafting, only uneven words shaped in the cramped moments he found between orders. The fragile page itself reveals its origin. The cheap, thin sheet and unsteady lines are consistent with the sorts of notes written in field conditions around the Marne in early September 1914. What seems plain at first glance is actually a fragment of a life carried through mud and dust. Near the middle of his sentences, one phrase stands out. A great change is near. There are no details, no explanations. The words arrive almost like an interruption, heavier and more deliberate than the rest of his lines. The pressure of his pen hints that he wanted this sentence to remain. In that moment, the ordinary note turns into a puzzle. Was he describing his own feelings, or did he glimpse something larger moving around him? For historians, letters like this hold two truths at once. They are artifacts, ink, paper, creases, and they are voices, speaking across time. The job is to read what is present and what is left unsaid. Pen strokes that darken where the hand pressed down, drying ink that fades mid-word. Small omissions in phrasing. These are not accidents. They make visible the pressure and strain under which the letter was written. The stronger stroke under the word change is one such sign, as if emphasis replaced the detail he could not name. The blank spaces carry almost as much weight as the words themselves. Was he avoiding certain information because of the military censorship, or was this a personal choice to shield his family from fear? Each gap opens questions that cannot be answered with certainty, but they remind us of the circumstances in which such a page was created. Fatigue, haste, and a need to communicate quickly before the moment to write disappeared. To the family who later unfolded it, those absences may have seemed like a comfort. To us, they are an unsettling silence. That is why the phrase, "a great change is near," becomes so striking. It is at once restrained and loaded with feeling. To his loved ones, it may have read as reassurance or gentle hope. To us, with distance, it resonates as both a personal reflection and a signal of a wider situation pressing down on him. Here the modest letter ceases to be only family correspondence. It becomes a point where larger history enters an ordinary man's hand. Taken in full, the page is a portrait of conditions as much as emotions. Its thin paper shows shortages. Its folds reveal movement, slip back into his pocket, after every stolen line. Even its uneven script reflects a soldier, writing while tired, balancing his pen on whatever surface was closest. What seems like a scrap of paper is in fact one of the few lasting records of what daily service at the front actually looked and felt like. It tells us that history was written not only in grand reports, but in uneven strokes left behind by men who were never trying to be heard beyond their kitchen tables at home. The words stand today as a quiet signal. We see them as clues, evidence of shifting ground beneath a man who could not record names or strategies, yet still sensed that something about his world was about to change. His family would have received the page as a simple letter. We hold it now as testimony of a moment that carried more weight than he could describe. And it leaves us to ask what daily life felt like for men writing under those circumstances. Men who carried exhaustion in their voices as much as in their steps. From here, the phrase points outward. What would it have meant for an ordinary soldier, silent in his fears, but steady in his duty, to be part of an army in retreat? What did it feel like to face days of falling back without knowing whether they would ever stop? Retreat. That was the world our soldier inhabited. Days that unspooled in reverse, whole columns moving steadily backward, without clarity about where they might finally stop. In early September 1914, many Allied units were shifting away from the advancing German line after their first engagements, and their letters preserve the inner state of those retreats. Uncertainty, fatigue, and the constant sense of being caught in motion without resolution. What mattered for the men was not the language of strategy, but the trail of lived moments, mud clinging to boots, stiff packs cutting into shoulders, familiar villages falling silent in their wake. Imagine a narrow road on a late summer evening, dust rising beneath thousands of feet. The air is filled with the clatter of equipment, the rhythmic steps of soldiers who had already marched all day, and the muffled hush of civilians watching them pass with faces pale against door frames. Alongside the military movement is the presence of ordinary life unravelling, families with handcarts, children pressing close to mothers, farm animals driven hastily ahead. These were not anonymous figures, but people sharing the same road, their futures tied to the armies stepping past. In such a setting, exhaustion cannot be separated from the sorrow of withdrawal. Each mile etched another layer of uncertainty across faces too young for such weight. The letter that prompted this reflection gives us only glimpses. He does not describe places or movements, but his pauses and omissions hold their own testimony. A brief mention of hunger suggests rations arriving late or eaten cold. A short remark about little rest allows us to imagine the way men might have collapsed against hedgerows, eyelids heavy, only to be jarred awake by the call to rise again. He did not need to say more. The fragments themselves speak by what they lack. In that quiet restraint, readers at home would have recognized both his effort to shield them and the fatigue lying just beneath his words. Here, context matters. Official reports of the time were couched in deliberate language. Retreats were described as tactical repositioning, maneuver, adjustment towards stronger positions. They carried a tone meant to reassure. Letters, by contrast, recorded the retreat as it was lived. Boots rubbed raw, meals swallowed, half cold, nights fractured by sudden alarms. Official reports frame retreat in strategic language. Letters record the lived shape of it. Boots, blisters, cold soup. That contrast is what makes one man's sparse note so valuable as a record of what it meant to keep walking backwards through his own country. A single vignette can illustrate more than pages of abstraction. Picture the men stopping briefly in a churchyard of a village emptied of its congregation. The bell remains silent, yet its rope still sways from some earlier tolling. Soldiers rest on the low stone wall, helmets tipped back, packs resting on the ground. One carefully removes a boot to reveal a heel already raw from days of movement. He lines the inside with a scrap of cloth, takes a sip from his canteen, and reties the laces before setting the boot down again, ready to stand once more. There is no complaint in the letter, but we know from thousands of similar accounts that such small struggles define the retreat more than any mapped line. It was in these details, small, domestic improvisations, that the body carried what the reports could not say. The silence within the soldier's words also deserves attention. Families who open such letters often look for reassurance, but they could never ignore the gaps. By omitting names of towns, by offering only the vaguest hints of conditions, he preserved two things at once: obedience to military censorship and a desire to protect those at home from deeper fears. Yet those very silences were telling. They left readers to piece together a truth that official notices did not capture. A father or a wife might pause over the lack of detail, wondering how much was being left unsaid. In that restraint, the voice of the retreat became audible. And yet, inside this world of endless backward steps, something shifts quietly in his tone. Beneath every mile walked and every road abandoned was a larger question he could not spell out: whether this endless retreat was a shape of defeat, or whether it might give way to some turning point. The letter captures the surface of exhaustion, but also hints at a deeper perception, a kind of awareness that history was pressing toward a moment beyond what he was allowed to describe. It is here that we begin to see how his words, small and restrained, carry more than day-to-day fatigue. He suggested something else rising within the uncertainty, something that could not yet be named. For modern readers, this is the weight of his testimony. He lived through the liminal days when retreat seemed permanent, and yet he sensed the shape of change hovering in the distance. Not the collapse of his nation, but not yet relief either, simply the pause between the two. And so, when his sentence tightened into one clear phrase, it carried unexpected gravity. He wrote little, but the ground was shifting. The silence around his words becomes as important as the words themselves. What seemed fragmentary is in fact the careful shaping of experience into lines short enough to survive both the march and censorship. For him, retreat was more than kilometers retraced. It was the feeling that some unnamed shift was approaching. That tonal change leaves us on a threshold. He did not expand, did not provide explanation, yet he left a signal. A few words, carried home in faint handwriting, still ask us to listen more closely. The everyday details of boots, hunger, and brief sleep ground us in the lived retreat. The restrained gesture towards something greater points to where his letter turns, because inside that world of silence and endurance, he wrote a phrase that has outlived the march itself. And it is precisely there, in the pause between retreat and something else, that his words open the door to the next part of his story. A great change is near. The words drop quietly into his letter, separate from everything else. He had just written of his health, of the marches, of what might pass for ordinary details in wartime. Then, almost abruptly, these 4 words appear, leaning heavier than the others. No explanation follows, and no surrounding sentences prepare us for them. You can almost imagine him pausing at the page, pressing the nib a little harder, then moving on. To read them now is to recognize their weight. Most soldiers' letters carried the same familiar tone: reassurance for families, statements of being well, hope that conditions were steady. Yet this short line does not sit with easy reassurance. It hovers between comfort and warning, between possibility and uncertainty. And that is where its force lies. It is not a statement of fact, but a fragment of feeling suspended between two directions at once. From the family side, the phrase might have been read with cautious hope. His mother or siblings, turning the paper under lamplight, could have thought he meant the retreat was ending, or that orders might soon move him toward calmer ground. The openness of the language allowed them to attach optimism where little existed. Hope, in correspondence, often grew out of such vaguest hints. But from his own perspective, sitting among fellow soldiers after another day of marching away from the front, the phrase may have held a darker shade. A great change could have meant a coming clash. It could have meant the end of marching backward and the beginning of something far more dangerous. It could even have been his way of steeling himself for what he felt might be near. A test of survival. He could not tell them outright. The uncertainty is the key. He leaves no anchor, forcing us to accept that both hope and dread may be present in those same words. This mixture of meanings reflects how letters walked a careful line. Soldiers often withheld specifics, not only because official rules limited detail, but also because they wished to protect those at home. Exact places, conditions, or dangers were left unsaid. Instead, sentences surfaced that carried only suggestion. Simplicity and vagueness allowed the letter to pass safely through hands, while still reaching its destination with meaning between the lines. Families learned to read this form of writing as carefully as any message. The absence of description did not signal emptiness, it signaled care. The word change itself matters. He could have written event or news, but he selected a word that implies transition, a shift from one state into another. Great change carries weight without clarity, as if chosen deliberately. It presented to his family a sense of movement ahead without naming what sort. That choice might have been his single act of honesty in the letter, without details, but with acknowledgement that what lay ahead would not resemble what came before. Step back for a moment and consider the timing. Early September 1914 was uncertain for every side. For weeks, Allied formations had been yielding ground before German advance. Soldiers marched, unsure whether each new day would worsen the retreat. At precisely this moment, however, the situation was beginning to alter. Commanders were making choices that would stop the retreat and force a new stand. From where he sat, he could not have known the outline of those decisions, yet he felt enough to mark it. A great change is near. This is why his short phrase, though vague on the page, reads for us now with unexpected clarity. He captured sensation before certainty. He sensed the atmosphere shifting without knowing the reason. The letter holds that moment, an intuition preserved by accident, a private murmur revealing more than any official statement could have done. To the historian, the phrase bears significance because it lines up with its moment in September 1914. What he could only whisper as unease or hope, we can locate against the larger frame, the armies closing into what would soon be called the First Battle of the Marne. That battle marked not just a halt in the retreat, but a turning point for the entire war. In hindsight, his quiet words become more than family reassurance. They become a thread linking personal voice to historical shift. So when we look back across a century, we see the phrase reflecting three layers all at once. To him, it was a private admission produced in fatigue and uncertainty. To his family, it was comfort, a half-coded signal that change might bring relief. To us, it has become evidence that ordinary men could feel great events approaching without any need or ability to state them outright. The strength of his letter lies in that tension. Its surface reassures, its pause suggests more, and its hidden space echoes with the anticipation of something undefined. Letters like this did not claim foresight, yet they often preserved impressions sharper than strategy maps. They deliver how history felt while it was still forming. Yet the words also invite a curiosity we cannot easily resist. What exactly was this change, and how close was it? Could we map his brief, unsteady tone onto the movements of armies in that first week of September? What if a single phrase from the quiet of his pocket aligns with one of history's decisive moments? We can, and the map points to the Marne. And with that recognition, the letter stops being only private. It reaches outward toward the larger story, moving just beyond his awareness, a story that he unknowingly walked through while shouldering his pack, one step after another. Soldiers did not know when they stood at places that maps later called decisive. They marched, carried packs, followed commands without ever seeing the larger picture. Days blurred in routines of movement, hunger, and tired feet. Looking back, we can line those days as markers, noting them as moments where history shifted. That distance between their unknowing present and our hindsight is one reason this single soldier's words matter. His letter lies exactly in early September 1914, during the weeks when Europe's armies bent the future. Without naming it, and without realizing it, he placed his voice alongside what we now call the First Battle of the Marne. The Marne has inherited its reputation as a turning point. In the span of a week, the German advance across northern France stalled, and the chance of Paris falling slipped away. For weeks beforehand, French and British forces had pulled back steadily, step upon step, village after village. Soldiers writing home knew only this rhythm of retreat, the steady backward pull of roads under their boots. Yet higher in the chain of command, decisions had begun to form. French leaders saw a narrow chance to reverse the tide, aided by reinforcements and careful timing. At the ground level, letters still carried fatigue and caution. At the level of commanders, the retreat was about to change direction. Historians now mark early September 1914, what we remember as the First Battle of the Marne, as the point that broke Germany's attempt at a rapid campaign. The grand plan to seize Paris and force quick victory came apart in those days. A combined Allied counterstroke, including General Monery's flank attack and the timely commitment of British forces, forced the German retreat. What followed was not fresh advance but long stalemate, the opening movements of the trench lines that would dominate the war. From above, the outcome is clear. The Marne checked the German drive and set the struggle onto different ground altogether. Our soldier knew none of this. His letter held no names of places or divisions. He could not describe the manoeuvres that encircled him, and even if he had overheard fragments, he would not have risked sharing them. What he had instead was only feeling, days that seemed endlessly backward, then a slight pause, that suggested a shift. His phrase, "a great change is near," lived within the realm of experience, not military definition. It was neither foresight nor strategy. It was the weight of hours as he felt them. That is what makes his words important. They show us how history tastes before it hardens into reports or timelines. He did not recognize the first battle of the Marne. He recognized only the slowing of boots, whispers among comrades, small changes in rhythm that reached him through exhaustion. His family would not have understood the strategy either. They would only have read a reassurance, vague but hopeful enough to hold on to. What he felt as a shift, historians later named as decisive. The Marne reminds us that battles exist on two scales, one written in commands and maps, the other lived in bodies and brief thoughts exchanged. From the perspective of headquarters, the week carried plans, counter-strikes and adjustments. From the perspective of men on the road, it carried hunger, silence and the uncertain tone of rumours. Both are true accounts, but it is the soldier's letter that captures what it felt like from the ground, what change meant when you could not place yourself on a map. It is tempting, when looking back, to imagine that soldiers must have sensed the coming turn. Yet the truth is more restrained. He wrote of change without attaching it to victory, defeat, or survival. We interpret it now through the lens of outcome. He experienced it only as atmosphere. This restraint is what lends the phrase its power. It proves that testimony from below carries weight precisely because it does not overstate. So we hold his words alongside history, acknowledging that both scales are needed. The Marne closed one chapter of movement and opened another of stalemate. For the soldier, it was another day of moving, writing when possible, and choosing what little to confide. His letter preserves a moment's breath, an instinct, a suggestion, before larger events made sense of it. That gap between what he felt and what history now records is the measure of ordinary experience during war. And yet, even with hindsight, we must linger on what mattered to him most. Not the arrows on maps, not the speeches of leaders, but the things he saw and touched and carried. His letter gives indirect signs of these, mentioning health, brief hunger, simple reassurances. The words themselves may be sparse, but read against their silence, they tell us what a soldier valued enough to put on paper. If we want to understand him more fully, we must consider those daily surroundings. What did it mean to watch familiar villages vanish behind him? What impressions filled his sight as he raised his head from the road? What fragments of landscape reached his pen when he paused to write? To answer that, we need to picture the world through his eyes, reduced not to maps, but to steps, sounds, and brief glances. And that turns us toward the things a soldier actually saw each day. What the soldier carried in his eyes were not the arcs of maps or the orders whispered in staff tents, but the ordinary images of each passing day. A ditch worn down at the edge of a road where thousands of boots had pressed, rain collecting in shallow pools, a village with shutters half closed, women standing with baskets of bread, watching columns go by without a word. These sights were not strategy. They were moments pressed so close to him that paper and ink seemed the only way to hold them still. And when he wrote them down, he gave us the clearest record possible of daily truth at the Marne. One scene stood out, his comrade asleep on damp ground, body curled into thin cloth, breath rising slowly into chill air. The coat was too slight for the night, its fabric clinging from heavy use. He did not wake even at the chatter of feet nearby. In such a picture, fatigue defined itself without needing any other description. For soldiers who marched, this was how the body eased itself between orders, through sleep so deep it ignored discomfort, dirt, and even the sounds of war waiting just beyond. Another moment, the ringing of a bell, not in celebration, not even in rhythm, but carrying into the air above tired men and their boots. A church bell that once marked marriage or midday rest, instead echoed across a road filled with weapons and carts. Imagine how the sound felt, cutting through dust and murmurs, reaching ears conditioned to the scrape of leather and the shifting of rifles. He preserved it as memory because it was a sound of place, an anchor to older meanings, even while the village itself bent beneath new ones. Meals marked the same pattern of unremarkable importance. He wrote of bread broken and passed hand to hand, of soup poured into dented tins, of a piece of fruit pressed into his palm by a silent civilian. The food itself was simple, yet in the act of eating lay the pause, the brief sense of stillness that could never be granted otherwise. A spoonful of soup made mouths fall quiet, just for a moment. Men sitting against walls or hedgerows felt themselves capable of lifting their packs again. In his letter, food did not serve as description of taste. It was the hinge between exhaustion and motion, the thing that carried them forward another mile. You can also see the land through his words, crops left untended in late heat, fields lying unworked, dust rising in daylight and clinging to throat and cloth, roads thick with soldiers and horses, some carrying the wounded backwards, while others dragged supplies forward. The countryside blurred into haze and movement, its order undone by too many feet. But it was not the shape of tactics he recorded here or anywhere else. It was how French villages and open space appeared to the man walking across them, seeing everything dissolve in a matter of hours. Historians often lean on letters precisely because they record these ordinary images that official reports omit. What is remembered in such words is not the line of advance, but the texture of place as it was lived. Silence, too, reached the page. A hush before the noise arrived. Soldiers waiting, speaking little, listening to breath and movement in the stillness. Then in the distance, rolling thunder of guns far enough to blur into echo, yet close enough to free shoulders and hands. He recalled that brief pause, the line between safety and danger. For him, it was not about which batteries fired or what range they carried. It was memory of what it felt like to stand in quiet a second before sound would change the air itself. Even walking became memory. He measured time by steps. He wrote lips dry, legs sore, the pack swaying like a weight in rhythm with the endless stride. The world narrowed to the back of the man ahead, boot soles scraping dirt. The road was not ground, gained or lost. It was only the count of steps endured, the press of straps digging into shoulders. Each minute was marked less by distance than by repeated lift and fall of bodies carrying themselves forward. Yet hope rose in fragments, small notes of songs started somewhere in the column. A promise of new rations hinted in rumour, the quiet spark of an inside joke traded between men tying bootlaces. None of it claimed victory, but each piece lifted burden for moments at a time. His words carried these fragments like tiny signals to his family, that amid exhaustion, something like endurance survived. The rations might improve, men might catch themselves humming a tune beside the road. That was enough to mark in ink. What historians later titled a decisive battle came to him only in such sparse measures. Light across a steeple, children waving with uncertain eyes from a fence, a laugh shared on stones along the roadside. He did not record manoeuvres. He laid down glimpses of daily life, exactly the kind of detail that would vanish if left to archives of war councils alone. One image against another, they form the world of battle as it was lived, not commanded. Here lies his quiet contribution. In a single fragile page, he showed that the war was defined not only by generals drawing arrows on maps, but by men noticing what passed directly before them. Deuced that tasted dry. Soup still hot enough to sting the tongue. The sound of a bell interfering with boots against road. These were the points of detail by which he measured and later remembered. In comparison, official accounts flatten events into dates and outcomes. His words bring back the ground-level truth in human scale, forcing us to accept that it mattered. If you sit with his letter, it reads like windows opening and closing across rural roadsides, a glance at civilians without speaking, a line about eating together without appetite, a note about heavy sleep in a ditch. Each fragment is immediate. Each fragment is real. Together they remind us that what scholars now mark in broad terms was lived in pieces, too small to collect in archives, and too fragile to survive beyond paper carried home from the front. It is tempting to search for meaning beyond these fragments, yet their value is what they are. They show how war pressed onto a man's everyday senses, into his sight, into his hearing, into the feel of dust against his mouth. What came to count as decisive later was, in reality, seen and heard as only this. His letter is important not because it speaks in grand terms, but because it does not. And still, one question lingers. If such vivid pieces surrounded him, if he saw villages, comrades, fields, civilians, and heard bells and silence, why did he share so little? Why is the letter filled with restraint, words pared down to what seems almost ordinary? That question leads us to the spaces between sentences, where what he left unsaid begins to carry as much meaning as the words themselves. War letters are often defined as much by what they do not say as by what they set down in ink. Absence, hesitation, and restraint create their own kind of testimony. The men who carried paper in their pockets wrote with two audiences in mind, themselves and the people waiting far away to unfold those sheets. In between lay the unspoken, where caution, discretion, and care covered as much ground as words ever could. When our soldier wrote his brief note about a great change, he avoided specifics. No map coordinates, no names of comrades, no tally of the days without sleep. He offered a plain phrase, one that hinted while it concealed. This choice was not random. It reflected what many soldiers understood instinctively, that details could bring unnecessary worry and sometimes were unsafe. Whether out of love for his family, respect for discretion, or a quiet sense of responsibility, the words he carried into the letter stopped short of what he lived through. Imagine him at the moment of writing. He might have described the refugees pushing carts of belongings past his column. He might have tried to convey the heavy groans of injured comrades, or the sight of men collapsing at the roadside. Yet if he wrote line after line of those images, they could have been judged unfit for delivery, or worse, caused distress to the very people he longed to comfort. So he pressed his meaning into vaguer shapes. The silence on the page carried a second message. The truth existed, but it would not be set down here. Families learn to read these kinds of silences keenly. A clipped sentence could carry as much presence as a paragraph. Tone mattered. A mother might notice sudden brevity, a wife the flattening of once careful phrasing. Those gaps became signals, hints toward an inner life the page could not openly capture. In many homes, the act of listening to what was missing was as practiced as listening to what appeared. His choice of wording, "great change," shows how this worked in practice. He could not say, "we expect attack," or "I fear we will not survive." Such admissions would have drawn alarm or suspicion. Instead, he left his family with a phrase broad enough to interpret with hope. To them, it might have sounded like the end of retreat or the promise of safer ground. To him, perhaps it held dread of another clash. One phrase stretched across two meanings, its power lying in what it declined to explain. This was common across countless wartime letters. A description of things being quiet might hint that shelling had only just passed. A line about being well sometimes covered the absence of fellows who would not return. Soldiers shaped sentences that did not lie outright but carried double layers, one visible, one hidden. Families learned to search for those layers. They heard the note of fatigue beneath reassurance, or saw alarm in the sudden brevity of a page. What was shared and what was withheld combined into the message as a whole. Later, when survivors wrote memoirs free of such restraint, the difference was stark. Towns were named, dates set down, descriptions of mud, fire, and fear opened without limit. By contrast, their earlier letters looked narrow, selective, stripped of the very images that define their service. The comparison underscores a simple truth. Writing during the war was always layered. On one level, it provided comfort across distance. On another, it protected. And beneath both layers sat the memory that could not yet surface. Silence, then, is not blankness. It carries meaning of its own. Every line left plain, every detail avoided, forms part of the record. For our soldier, omitting the losses he witnessed did not erase them. It highlighted his decision to protect others from the cost. The restraint underscored his awareness. The gaps speak to us now as firmly as the words he did include. At home, this restraint produced long domestic rituals of reading. A sister might pause midway through the letter, attentive to pauses rather than claims. A father might hold the sheet up to the light, tracing the ink and thinking about what could not be mentioned. Families across Europe repeated such acts nightly in kitchens and parlours, knowing full well that the truth sat partly in what was not shared. Small silences took on weight, and meaning was reconstructed in the spaces around the visible words. We should also remember that these choices were not all mandatory. Some silences came directly from love, rather than fear of disclosure. Many men softened their accounts, writing more about meals or weather than brutality. They spared parents and sweethearts the knowledge of what a battlefield smelled or looked like at close distance. It was an act of care, a way of carrying the burden themselves, while granting families at least the image of calm. Silence could be as much gift as absence. Years later, veterans were candid about this effort. Many recalled placing their pen on paper, ready to describe the true scene, and then pulling back at the thought of the home. Instead of mud, they wrote fields. Instead of death, they wrote change. They crafted reassurance even while holding sharp images in memory. That same craft shaped the endurance of their letters, artifacts not just of battle, but of personal restraint. In the case of our soldier, what is unsaid about comrades or conditions may matter even more than what survived the page. He wrote nothing of fear or loss, but those realities sat close by. Families learned to recognize the shadow of absence, to feel the weight each missing detail implied. With every letter, they balanced gratitude for the words they had against the questions raised by what was left unwritten. Picture one scene at home. A letter is unfolded at a kitchen table. A mother begins to read aloud. She voices the lines about marching and health, but slows over the phrase, "a great change." The children listen, but even when she resumes, the silence left by that pause colours the room. Everyone senses that more lies behind the words. The letter has spoken, but its quiet has spoken too. That dynamic explains why slim envelopes still move us a century later. They are not only accounts, but also silences captured on paper. They carry not just the visible line, but the restraint surrounding it. His decision to keep certain truths away from the page is itself testimony, preserved as clearly as any map or diary entry. So when we read his voice today, attention must fall equally on what stands absent. Silence is itself a message, a record shaped in negative space. His great change stands out because empty margins surround it. The gaps hold part of his intention, reminding us that unsaid words can speak with the same weight as written ones. Placed against their time, those omissions guide us toward a larger frame. They suggest that something was stirring even if he could not write it directly. The pause in his sentences hints at a shift underway, one that pressed on every man walking those roads in September 1914. The letter captures exactly that, an atmosphere of anticipation without detail, silence carrying a sense of motion. And soon, the atmosphere itself would break. In the days that followed his writing, the quiet tone of retreat gave way to something new on the ground. Out of silence came sudden movement, and soldiers who had stepped backward for weeks found themselves called into a different kind of march. The letter's restraint leads us straight toward that moment. It is here, with silence still hanging, that we turn to what came next. By the second week of September 1914, fatigue gave way to something unexpected. Orders changed. Where men had braced themselves for yet another day of backward movement, they were suddenly told to stay, to gather, to prepare. The air shifted, not because maps or speeches explained it, but because the rhythm of retreat broke. A different kind of weight settled onto the ranks, the weight of standing their ground. This was the first moment when ordinary soldiers felt the larger turn. French and British forces coordinated flank pressure in the fields outside Paris, and the German drive that had seemed unstoppable began to falter. The men on the road had no way of naming this a strategy. All they knew was the abrupt pause in retreat, the call to hold rather than yield. It was change as sensation, a halt, a gathering, then the unfamiliar command to advance again. Imagine waking, expecting the same long march into uncertainty, only to hear instead that you are to stop, perhaps even to move forward. No map is shown, no grand words delivered. You learn it by tone of voice, by the sudden firmness in an officer's order. Your boots, which have been instruments of retreat, strike the dirt in resistance. That small reversal carried into the mind as powerfully as any tactical choice. The change in mood is almost audible in letters of the time. In days of retreat, sentences dragged, spare and fatigued. By mid-September, the same men wrote with hints of steadiness. "We stand today," one soldier told his wife, "and I believe we shall tomorrow." Such words carried no detail, but their shape revealed the swing of spirit. Their vagueness was not emptiness, it was reassurance rising from endurance. One image shows the turn clearly, men singing again. Not the full-voiced marching songs of early summer, but rough, uneven notes that caught at the edges of exhaustion. Voices carried down the line. Some hummed low, others fumbled words, but the sound itself mattered. After weeks of silence broken only by footsteps, their voices returned to them. A song, even a broken one, was resistance enough. Another scene came around the fire or in the pause of rations, a crust of bread, a ladle of soup, the same plain food as days before, yet in those hours it tasted different. Men who had chewed without appetite now spoke while eating. One even joked, another passed along a scrap of fruit offered by a villager. Small gestures, given shape by the sense that backward steps had ended. The change in spirit turned the simplest meal into signal they might hold here. This is where the letter we carry with us again finds its edge. A great change is near. His words, thin and unspecific, align almost perfectly with the mood of that week. He did not see staff tables or orders drafted in Paris. He did not trace movements of armies across paper. What he felt was the loosening in his chest as commands turned. What he named was not the Marne, but the feeling of it in lived time. Families at home, reading his page, could sense it too. A mother, passing the same hand that had written of endless marches, now found the phrase steady rather than weary. She had no way to know whether it meant safety or danger, but the voice inside it sounded less resigned. Tone became its own language, bridging what censorship forbade and what experience allowed. For historians, this correspondence embodies the shift that larger records later confirmed. The exact manoeuvres of September 1914 can be charted, but the letters explain how those choices descended into fatigue turned to steadiness. It was felt not in strategy, but in breath, in rhythm, in the weary hand that chose briefer, firmer lines. Think of momentum itself, as the soldiers understood it. Retreat had stretched endlessly, each day blurring backward. Then in a span of hours, the forward movement returned. That kind of reversal did not announce itself slowly. It broke in a single night of new orders, in a morning march that leaned not away, but against. The letter preserves that sensation, giving us not explanation, but the echo of change itself. This is the human scale of victory and defeat. What headquarters called a coordinated counterattack appeared to the marching column as faces steadier, songs resumed, food shared with slightly different taste. What maps show as turning flanks and repositioning, letters show as words pressed heavier, sentences cut shorter, filled suddenly with purpose. Neither scale cancels the other. Together they complete the picture. For the soldier, the importance was simple. He no longer trailed away, unsure of end or rest. He lifted his pack, knowing resistance was possible. His body remained as tired as before, but something steadied his steps. When he sent his letter home, he wrapped that change in a single phrase. In doing so, he gave us a primary record of what it felt like for doom to falter and resolve to begin. You can almost hear his relief without him saying it outright. His words avoid triumph, avoid detail, yet beneath the restraint you can sense the difference. Despair replaced by its opposite, fragile but present. Families who receive such lines in kitchens and parlours across France must have caught their breath. For the first time in weeks, the letters sounded like endurance not only endured, but shared with confidence. Resistance became its own form of sustenance. A man could measure it in the way his comrade sang off note, or in the calm of officers who no longer rushed them down roads. It showed in the way meals lingered, in the way silence was filled by voices again. None of these small things named the Marne, but all of them belonged to it. That is why his testimony matters. Official bulletins would later report that the German advance was halted, that Paris was preserved, that trenches began soon after. But in the moment, all that was written in the curve of a sentence, a great change is near. From his perspective, suspicion turned to belief, and that belief is still legible across the 100 years since. This section of his story also reminds us how quickly the human spirit could turn. Weeks of steady retreat bent men into silence. Days of resistance began to lift them into voice. That transition is as decisive in memory as in combat. It proves that wars are not only decided in sweeping moves, but in the way individuals stand and recall their presence within them. We can almost picture him that week. Pack on his back, boots raw with use, listening to the half voice of a song by the man beside him. His pen scratched only a phrase or two in the quiet, but that was enough. Change was upon him, though unnamed. What he sensed, history now affirms. That moment at the Marne became a hinge, not only in campaign, but in correspondence. And yet we end here with a question his letter cannot answer. The words stop on the page, preserved only as far as they could be carried home. He marked the turn, but did he himself survive the years that followed? Did the man who wrote of change walk into the long trench lines? Or do we hold in our hands one of his final messages? That we must now ask. What became of the man whose letter carried those few unforgettable words? That is the question that rises once we stop reading his phrase and begin searching for the person behind it. His voice crossed time to us, but his path through the war remains uncertain. After the week at the Marne, the trail of his footsteps fades. We do not know whether he continued to write, whether his health bore him through 4 long years, or whether this paper became one of the last surviving traces of his presence. Like thousands of others, his fate might lie, not in a neat conclusion, but in silence. This uncertainty is not failure, it reflects a truth of the Great War. For many men, records were incomplete, damaged, or lost. Some service files ended in lists of dates, a regiment named, a number, the day of entry. Others were destroyed in later conflicts, fires, or poor storage. What survived more often were small remnants, letters, photographs, names pressed into local memorials. Many soldiers' lives are remembered only by absence. Whether his endurance stretched across the trenches or ended at the Marne is unknown, and that gap itself speaks. Think for a moment of how widely soldiers' fates diverged. Some who stood at the Marne were moved directly into the trenches that scarred northern France, spending 4 years inside mud, cold, and artillery. Others were carried to hospitals in the aftermath, wounded during the counter-offensive, patched and returned to the line. And many families learned of their loss only through the absence of return. Their sons' names carved on memorial stones instead of graves, because bodies were never found when battlefields consumed all proof. Every path stood open across September 1914, from quiet endurance to sudden disappearance. From the family side, that uncertainty felt heavier still. They opened the envelope at home, read through his careful lines, stopped at "A great change is near." Weeks later, news drifted through newspapers and neighbours. There had been a battle near Paris. The German march was halted. Could they have linked his words to the headlines, seeing in them confirmation he had stood inside history. Yet as always, knowledge narrowed back to waiting. After the first letter, households hoped only for the next, counting days until a fresh envelope might fall onto the table. What followed in the broader war provides context. The Marne did not bring the end. After that first stand, the front stiffened. Men dug in, carving trenches across the countryside. They filled nights with mud, lice, and shells that fell without warning. Hope shifted from thoughts of victory to smaller wishes, relief from the lice, rotation out of the line, a chance to dry wet boots beside a short fire. For many, the great change at the Marne was not rescue, but the opening of nearly 4 years of strain. If his regiment remained in that line, then later letters, if any came, would have carried different tones. They might have mentioned flooding trenches or brief warmth found in a dugout. Descriptions of change would have slowed into requests for blankets or a hope for rest behind the front. In that sense, his phrase of September 14 preserved a sharp moment of transition. It was true as prophecy, but it also bore the feeling of an approaching future more complicated than any single victory. For others who wrote during those days, the Marne was already their end. Letters handed home became final words, opened after the men who sent them had already fallen. We cannot say whether our soldiers shared that fate, but this uncertainty is meaningful. It reminds us that the silence left in archives reflects the silence families live daily. Every dawn, another gamble, every unopened letter, the edge of dread. It matters to pause on these gaps. When the story of one soldier cannot be finalized, we learn something about the war itself. It consumed not only men but their traces. Absence is part of its record. Families carried on with fragments, letters, images, small keepsakes, and kept them inside trunks or drawers long after names blurred from memory. That act of preservation became their own form of endurance, and those acts are why we can still read his voice at all. The survival of his letter tells its own story. Imagine the journey. It crossed war-torn fields inside a stretched postal system, arrived folded into a jacket pocket at home, and was tucked away by hands that could not discard it. Even as households moved, decades passed, and conflicts returned, someone resisted the forgetting. The page endured in a box, in a trunk, in a desk. Only later, when memory itself changed hands, was it placed into an archive where voices of the war could speak to others. Without such care, his words would have vanished. That they endured is not accident, it is a kind of message itself. The paper became the true survivor. It outlasted rifle, uniforms, maps, even high commands. Cannons of the Marne grew silent, divisions disbanded, generals faded from files. But the ink of a quiet soldier's line remained. Thin strokes on fragile paper crossed a century more fully than iron or steel. In that survival lies the proof that letters set their own record of war, one measured not by victories but by presence. Let's sit again with the imagined family. A mother or sister can hold the letter long after any official notice has come. Turn into it not for information, but for touch. Fingers brush the indentations where his pen pressed harder on the word change. Eyes follow the curve of his familiar hand. In that room, the silence of what did not come back is met by the voice that did. For them, the letter is not document. It is a stand-in for presence. For us, it is both. We may never reach his personal ending. Perhaps his name is carved in stone at a communal memorial, joining many who became collective rather than individual remembrance. Perhaps he stood through years, one of those who returned with silence of another kind, too marked by experience to find words again. Either way, the letter outlasted the body's certainty. That is not to diminish him, but to mark how pieces of war remain. Survival can mean the endurance of words, even when faces and forms are lost to time. This is why the letter's fate cannot be separated from the man's. It carried further than he may have, yet it keeps him present as no other record now can. A scrap of paper, folded, carried, opened, saved, that is what endures. It gives us the phrase, "A great change is near," as his legacy, bridging over every silence we cannot close. So when we speak of his fate, it is this: we do not know his end, but we know his words endured. That endurance is heavy with meaning. It illustrates how fragile testimony can cross a century when larger structures fail. It shows us how ordinary families became keepers of history, handing a single page through time until we can hold it. And it leaves us to weigh the value of such a fragment, compared with the polished proclamations once issued on the same days. Which brings us to the next question. Why should a faded piece of paper hold more truth for us now than the confident reports of generals and officials who claim to explain the war as it unfolded? The answer lies not in maps or records, but in the presence of the human voice those papers preserved, and that is where we turn next. Why does this single sheet of paper still matter to us now? The question is not rhetorical. Its ink, pressed into paper more than a century ago, continues to ask why a private letter outlives whole libraries of official reports. What we hold is not only evidence of a man's presence, but something greater, an unfiltered record of experience that no strategy map or communique could carry. This is why the letter deserves our attention when so many other documents have fallen from view. Large reports told the story of divisions and brigades. They described shifts as enemy advance halted or forces holding firm. These words were composed to persuade, to shape confidence, to steady morale. Their tidy phrasing was meant for governments and newspapers, not households waiting at kitchen tables. Compare this to a soldier writing in his own uneven hand. A great change is near. The difference is not scale, but substance. The report names an outcome. The letter records what it felt like in the shadow before the outcome became certain. That distinction is the starting point for understanding why such fragile sheets matter so deeply. We can compress the reasons into 3 simple truths. First, letters preserve voice and tone, the cadence of experience that official phrases never attempt. Think of his careful restraint, choosing change instead of attack or battle. Second, letters reveal through omission what could not safely or willingly be said, the empty space around his phrase telling us as much as the phrase itself. Third, letters bear the texture of the world lived, the crease of a page stored in a breast pocket, ink faint where supplies ran dry, a word pressed darker where his pen lingered. Each of these qualities turns personal writing into history's most human source. Historians often describe letters as windows into the past. Unlike polished memoirs written after the fact, these fragments retain the uncertainty of lived time. They preserve the way ordinary men and women felt before they knew what would happen. That is what makes them such valuable testimony. They let us see through the glass of personal thought rather than the mirror of hindsight. The soldier who wrote of a great change could not know how the Marne would be remembered, and yet his words line up uncannily with the shift historians later confirm. That alignment shows how private expressions can capture the atmosphere of history as faithfully as official archives. Picture again the moment his family read the letter. A mother smoothed its folds under a lamp, her eyes catching on those 4 words. For her, the meaning might have tilted toward hope. For him, the meaning may have tilted toward dread. The ambiguity is permanent, and its power lies in refusing closure. Families lived in that ambiguity, night after night, and when we read their letters, we inherit the same pause between reassurance and fear. It forces us to read with attention, listening not only to what is said, but to what is carefully withheld. Reports and propaganda tried to dictate feelings. Bold headlines promised certainty. Victories made grand. Losses muted behind slogans. But letters resisted that rhythm. They were shaped by censorship and care, yet they still sounded unpolished, hesitant, real. This is why a single sentence from a soldier endures more strongly than the flourishes of wartime newspapers. What propaganda flattened, letters restored. They returned to the scale of a voice, uneven but true, trimmed of detail but alive with emotion. Consider how families decided what to keep. Newsprint yellowed and was thrown aside. Official notices were read and then filed or forgotten as new ones arrived. Letters were never discarded. They were folded into boxes, tucked into drawers, passed down until they became family relics. That simple act tells us their value. A note meant for one evening became an artifact guarded for generations. The hands that saved it knew its worth, without needing historians to pronounce it rare. Every soft crease was a proof of someone preserved against time. Think also of how maps freeze experience. Arrows drawn across rivers and roads declare where armies moved, but they erase what such movement felt like. The letter recovers precisely that, the human scale of each forward or backward step. Men did not march as arrows across paper. They marched as tired bodies down dusty roads. His chosen words open that gap for us, allowing empathy rather than abstraction. The map tells us how far troops shifted. The letter tells us what that shift weighed inside a man's chest. Multiply his words by the thousands of other letters still stored in trunks and archives, and you see why private writing remakes the image of the war. Official records tell us how many days a battle lasted, or how many regiments were committed. Letters tell us about blisters, about laughter snatched in rain, about a crust of bread passed in silence. Each detail is small, but together they reveal more than strategy ever could. A single soldier's voice becomes the ground truth that balances commanding voices from above. It is striking, too, how restraint becomes a kind of honesty. He did not tell his family that victory had come, or that safety was assured. He wrote only of change. That word distilled both his uncertainty and his awareness. It had space wide enough to hold contradiction. To his family, possible relief. To himself, possible danger. To us, the moment of transition. In ways official documents cannot, his restraint allowed the phrase to live across each interpretation without breaking into false clarity. This teaches us about memory as well. When history is viewed only through outcomes, the war seems inevitable, its path already cut in stone. Letters break that illusion. They show us how events felt uncertain, lived forward without knowledge of tomorrow. That is their greatest truth, not their accuracy to events already known, but their fidelity to the uncertainty of experience in real time. Letters preserve the war as it happened to the living, not just as it was later arranged by the recounting of survivors and officials. If we hold the page now, it speaks with both presence and absence. The faint curve of handwriting reminds us of his hand. The blank spaces remind us of his silence. Reports may preserve chronology, but letters preserve immediacy, and immediacy is what keeps the past human. To read a letter is to stand closer to the life that produced it, leaning over the same words as his family once leaned, breathing the same pause where he stopped writing. When measured against those qualities, the polished reports shrink. They deliver information but not recognition. The letter delivers recognition of self, of family, of human condition. That is why it matters not only as evidence but as connection. It bridges across time more securely than statistics. It resists vanishing because it carries relationship within itself. And so, holding his letter, we are invited to read differently. Scholars handle archives, but families already knew the truth. These pages carry weight greater than the paper itself. They remind us that history lives best when ordinary voices are allowed to endure. They show that silence, hesitation, and tone can speak more honestly than entire paragraphs of certainty. When you next encounter a wartime letter, whether in a museum, in an archive, or hidden in your own family's attic, read it not only for the ink, but for the gaps. Read it for thin handwriting and faded creases, for its pauses as much as its lines. Read it for what it says, and just as carefully for what it cannot. Because sometimes one faint sentence is enough to carry across centuries, holding meaning more firmly than polished declarations ever could. And from that recognition, the final part of our reflection waits. What such words, written quickly in fading light, now leave for us to consider. A single phrase, written quickly in fading light, carried more than the soldier himself could know. A great change is near was not strategy or proclamation, yet it marked the very start of a turning point later named by history. What mattered was not the map of movements, but the steady hand that shaped those 4 words. That fragile line became the human measure of the Marne moment, personal, uncertain, and enduring across time. History is never just in archives or maps, it lives in the voices left behind. If you've ever held a wartime letter, or if your family keeps one, share that story in the comments. And if you value these quiet glimpses of history, you're warmly invited to subscribe and stay part of the listening.